Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's first lecture. We're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking today about the pandemic ethics in the age of COVID-19 pandemic, and the sort of general ethical topic of whether or not promoting public health involves necessary or unnecessary restrictions on freedom, and sort of just thinking about ethical implications that come from this and different approaches, the sort of three different theories that we've looked at might actually kind of take towards thinking about what we should do in a pandemic, or what individuals' rights and responsibilities are, groups, like government officials' rights and responsibilities, what kinds of obligations we have to one another, etc. So first of all, there's a whole slew of issues that are ethical in nature that come up when we think about the pandemic, when we think about what's been going on for the last year and a half. Um, and there's a bunch of different topics that could be covered. And we'll talk a little bit about some of them here, but for any of them that are, of interest to you, feel free to discuss anything like this in the discussion forum. And we can talk about all sorts of things like this in the sort of discussion version of the class too. So there's lots of different issues. There's the issue of just general freedom versus public health, and whether or not we're allowed to do certain kinds of things, and whether or not the government or we should be allowed to restrict us, or whether or not we should restrict ourselves in the search for, or in an attempt to try and maximize public health, right, to make the most people the most healthy, to avoid the spread of the virus. There's the issue of public health and the economy, right? So with things like shutting down businesses and restricting people's ability to go places, um, had a pretty serious effect on the economy. And then so there's like a very interesting question of whether or not um, what was done to kind of attempt to preserve public health had enough of a bad impact economically to create some kind of moral disparity. Then there's masks and vaccines and social distancing issues, right? So each of these things has sort of sparked its own set of debates in the public sphere over the last year and a half. Vaccines are definitely really interesting. There's a whole, the whole issue of skepticism and hesitancy, besides just the issue of whether or not whether or not it's moral to mandate people to get a vaccine, whether or not it's in any way moral to force people to get a vaccine, or to force people to have some kind of medical procedure. But then also, when it comes to like personal responsibility, what responsibility individuals have to everyone else to get to be vaccinated, or at least to be set yourself up in such a way that you're not going to be a health risk for others. And then finally, stay-at-home orders, restrictions on travel, and then the trust that people, or distrust that people have now in certain authority figures. These are all big issues that have been raised and are of interest, and we'll talk about some more of them here. So there's an overarching ethical sort of consideration that's worth thinking about. You might think of it as a dilemma, but it's not entirely clear whether or not it really is a dilemma, right? A real ethical dilemma is when it's actually unclear, I think, what should be done, right? It's one thing over the other, right? Obviously, one thing has to be done, but which thing is the moral thing is the question. And here we have something along the lines of a ethical dilemma, but it's not. I don't know if it's unclear what to do, right? So the differences, or the sort of the oppositions, the things that oppose each other, are the public health and personal freedom, right? The public health, or public health is the idea of like public good, the good of the many, trying to save as many lives as possible at almost all costs, right? And attempts to protect the sort of vulnerable among us in order to keep the most people as healthy as possible, versus certain kinds of personal freedoms, right? So the personal choices that people want to make, whether or not they want to actually go out or stay at home, right? People's sort of risk to their own health, right? Do you have you get to make decisions every day about whether or not you're doing things that are risky, and putting yourself in certain kinds of situations, eating certain kinds of foods, flying on airplanes, doing extreme activities, just driving your car, right? You get to choose how much risk you actually put yourself in front of normally, but in some cases, maybe not. There's an interesting question of like what kinds of risks you should or shouldn't be allowed to take, right? And then risking other people's health if you want, right? This is the personal freedom, at least in the age of COVID, right? Going out under the guise of the possibility of not knowing that you are infected, right? It's a real interesting kind of question to think about, whether or not you shouldn't go out even though you don't feel sick, on the bare possibility that you might be infected without knowing it. So this brings us to, like, at least this sort of ultimate case study that we have been living through right before our eyes, when it comes to thinking about lots of these ethical issues. So the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, at least in the United States, right, began in mid-March, probably, of 2020, where the virus began to spread in the US. What we knew at the time was that it was a kind of coronavirus, but it was new, and that it was highly communicable, that it wasn't as deadly as something like SARS. I forget SARS, the specifics of SARS, but I believe SARS had something like a 1 in 10 death rate, but it was much less communicable. Whereas COVID has a much lower death rate, but it's highly communicable. But it's still, sometimes when people get COVID, it would require ventilators and very serious, intubation. They would have to be put under for long periods of time in order to survive. And then the other sort of big thing that was known right off the bat is that infections can be spread with no noticeable symptoms. Like it was possible for there to be a long period of incubation when somebody became infected, where they would spread the virus and never, actually feel very sick themselves. What was unknown, though, at the very beginning was how fast the virus was likely to spread, and we didn't have very good ideas of effective methods for reducing the spread. Right, like initially, people weren't wearing masks. People had no idea about masks, and then social distancing hadn't really been brought to the forefront as a thing. So all the kind of thought processes that there were that people should just try to stop being in contact with one another as much as possible and wash your hands a lot, right? Now, the early response, so when we respond to these kinds of, global catastrophe issues, there's an interesting question here of like, what exactly is the right way to deal with the kind of with a global pandemic, with the spread of a dangerous virus, and what's the sort of, does it matter how dangerous it is, how communicable it is? Like all of these things have got to be taken into consideration to think about like how to actually protect people. So like I remember, at least initially, right, doctors suggesting, because this is the kind of thing that's highly communicable, the ideal way of dealing with a highly communicable disease is if everybody just stays away from one another, right? If everybody kind of freezes in place. Under this idea, the virus can't spread, because if everyone in some way that has the virus is like quarantine, then the virus will kind of pass, once they become healthy again, and they won't have actually transmitted it to anyone else. That's sort of the ideal case, right? It's impossible to probably get that kind of ideal case where everybody freezes in place and we just luckily kind of freeze out the virus in this way. But there's a huge problem with this idea. And the idea really is that there's just lots of cases where people had no symptoms, right? And because there were lots of cases where people had no symptoms, it was very difficult to actually track how everything was being, communicated between individuals. because some people probably had it and didn't actually know that they had it. So what then, given this sort of understanding of how things, happen, what is the best way to respond? So, and there's a, there's a difference here, right, between how people actually responded and how people could have, would have, should have responded, right? Like now, hindsight is 2020. Knowing what we know now, if we had known then, the response might have been slightly different. And there's an interesting sort of way of thinking about this, right? Think back to the beginning of the pandemic when everything started to be shut down, right? That was how people did respond. Everything just all of a sudden in March and early April started to shut down under this idea that we ought to try and sort of freeze the virus out, which is, hopefully is possible. But then there's this question, did it work? Well, no, right? It didn't work very well. Though maybe it did slow the spread. It's very unclear. And there's this interesting question of is there a sort of right or wrong way to have responded here, both individually and as a whole group? Um, Given what we knew at the time, was the entire shutdown actually worth it? So this is a funny, I think, picture of somebody in Malibu getting arrested for surfing. Right? I mean, like that was an extreme. There was an extreme kind of idea of this shutdown, and that we should, like, everything should be closed, and that everybody should just stay home, and nobody should be doing anything. Uh, that seems like it was probably a bit of an overreaction, though maybe some of it, did stop the spread, and maybe some of it stopped the spread in ways that would have been more dangerous. I don't think we needed to stop people from being at least minimally active or out in the ocean. So there's this question of whether or not it's ever wrong to overreact when it comes to certain kinds of intentions, right? So if you have a good intention, like an intention to save lives, to protect public health, to protect public good, um, is it wrong if you overreact in certain ways when you act with the best intentions? So this question kind of, comes, does it, when the overreaction actually impinges on people's freedoms, like, does that make it wrong? Or do we weigh the relative, fear and possible danger that the reaction, came in light of, even if it ended up being an overreaction, against the impingement on any freedoms? So, like, does the right to act in certain ways ever outweigh the duty that people have towards everyone else's health, right? So, lots of people want to go out and protest. Lots of people want to be able to go to, worship in churches. Different kinds of, people want to go out and eat at restaurants and things. But, those rights to act in those ways, um, are they outweighed by the duty that people have to be, you know, helpful to everyone else when it comes to everyone's health? It's an interesting question, right? So, and then there's the sort of further question of who gets to decide in the moment, like what counts as too much freedom and too much restriction. Um, what does it seem to be like? What's reasonable here, and who gets to sort of be the arbiter of what counts as reasonable? Um, in the reading, there's sort of one very interesting point here, I think, is that science doesn't and really can't make policy decisions, right? We've talked, people talk a lot about, like, depending on the science, depending on where the science points us, to decide what we should and shouldn't do in these kinds of situations. But science itself can't make the policy decisions, right, that actually affect our lives. You have to have certain kinds of values that you can then apply to actual scientific data to determine what should and shouldn't be done in these kinds of cases, right? But this ultimately all, I think, goes back to this kind of, we didn't know, right, what was going to happen. And because we didn't know what was going to happen, you have to just take the best possible action that you can under, under incomplete knowledge. So we get this sort of morality in uncertain times, right? What's the right thing to do when you don't know what to expect? And how is it possible to act in a, a way where you are trying to take the right action when things are uncertain, right? This is sort of an interesting question, right? Remember, like, think about utilitarianism has this whole view that ultimately, if you're not doing the thing that's maximizing people's happiness, you're doing the wrong thing. But you might not be blameworthy for doing the wrong thing because you didn't know. But in this kind of case, you really should be trying to maximize happiness. So what's the right thing to do in this kind of case? Is it just act in such a way that you have the best intentions, and whether or not you like sort of overreact, is that acceptable just because you had good intentions? Um, it's difficult to see, right? So and then there's lots of different ways to sort of use the moral theories that we've discussed so far to kind of attempt to think through some of these issues, right? So um, on the utilitarian view, we ought to be trying to look to the consequences of the actions to try and make the best consequences happen. Well, what's the best consequences? I mean, I don't think it's entirely clear, but probably the most amount of people saved with the least amount of rights violated, right? Um, Whereas like a deontological approach is looking more towards like attempting to not violate people's rights, while also keeping everybody alive. Of course, you need to be alive in order to have your rights not violated. So there's sort of a give and take there, where the utilitarians and I think the sort of Kantians or deontological approach, they have similar goals and similar ways of approaching them. It's just what things they're actually going to be focusing more on, right? The deontological approach focuses more on rights and duties people have to one another, whereas the utilitarian approach focuses more on um, maximizing people's well-being in some way. And then finally, like the virtue ethics response, I think is maybe the best way to think about how we ought to try and prepare ourselves. So the idea is to try and respond in such a way as to have a virtuous response, right? Have a response that ends up being good and fitting the actual situation. And the only way to kind of prepare for these things is in an attempt to habituate ourselves to respond well to these kinds of situations, right? Um, the issue is, it's hard to habituate yourself to these kinds of things when you don't run into these kinds of situations very often. This kind of thing, this is the first time in most of our lifetimes, I think, that anything like this has happened. And you'd have to be you would have to have been around in the time of like the Spanish flu for something similar to have happened, which was I think in 1920s, maybe even earlier. I'm sure. I mean, there have clearly been other like epidemics in different places of different kinds of things, but nothing like this pandemic. Um, so it's difficult, I think, to probably attempt to habituate yourself in such a way that you can act in a virtuous way, act in such a way that we do well at both respecting people's rights and saving as many people as possible. But at the very least, that is sort of I think maybe the best attempt at an approach. It's just a question of what the specifics would actually be. All right, so now on to a few of the different specific topics or things that have occurred in this pandemic, and what we should think about kind of the restrictions versus the public health goods, and whether or not there are any sort of ethical considerations going both ways. So, what are some ethical considerations pertaining to things like social distancing and stay-at-home orders? Right. Well, so we've got a restriction on people's freedom, uh, literally on their freedom of movement and their freedom to do things. Right. Freedom of activity. You can still, you're not confined to your home. You're not like put in a jail cell, but you are. We were told to stay home and stay away from people that we, didn't have to be near, like our families. Um, and so the idea here was to restrict people's freedom, restrict people's right to, commingle and go out, with the goal of stopping the spread of the virus, with the goal of trying to promote public health with the goal of trying to, make the most people the least sick, right? um, but what kinds of, there were huge, interesting downsides to this entire activity, right? There was a massive disruption of business as usual. And I don't just mean, like actual businesses, right? Business as usual for every individual person. And so what comes with this massive disruption are things like economic issues, right? Where all of a sudden lots of people don't have jobs, don't have ways to provide for themselves. Childcare, right? And all children have to come home now, and all of a sudden there's a huge extra burden on the people that normally need to be out working or providing in some way for themselves and their family. And these children now need to be cared for, right? And they're not able to be cared for by the normal childcare providers, because the normal childcare providers are at schools and things that are now closed. And then the other huge thing is, like different psychological issues, right? Not being able to see individuals that you are, friends with, close with, family members, things like that, creates huge kind of psychological, like, issues of loneliness, issues of, like, not being connected with one another, um, and stress, and lots of stress. So these kinds of, you know, the response of the response to the pandemic of saying, okay, everybody needs to stay at home, it comes at a certain cost, but there's ultimately this sort of big question that I think still is not fully understood, or we haven't actually answered yet, is, was the stay at home order effective at actually curbing enough of the spread so that, in a sense, the one value outweighs the other value? Is it the case that we really did do enough to save enough lives that outweighs the detrimental downsides? Masks is a sort of another interesting ethical issue, right? One problem here, I think, clearly is just a lot of things have been politicized in certain ways, and that kind of makes them more interesting from certain ethical perspectives. But I think mask wearing is kind of an obviously interesting case here, right? On all of the ethical theories, mask wearing seems like a something that's simple and helpful to do, right? So it's a simple, helpful solution to stop the spread, and it's minimally invasive. That is, it doesn't actually cause you too much pain or trouble or difficulty, right? And it allows you to protect yourself as well as as well as others. This seems like, on a utilitarian framework, this is a no-brainer, right? You're doing something that doesn't cause you that much discomfort or unhappiness in order to try and maximize everyone else's, happiness. You're protecting yourself and others, right? On a deontological framework as well, right? You don't have to always help everyone, right? But you should try to help other people as much as you possibly can. On the deontological framework, we have what we might call an imperfect duty to help others, and so, wearing a mask is something that you can do in order to do that. It seems like a no-brainer, but I still don't understand why there are people that go around without covering their noses. So, do restrictions on freedoms, actually ever violate people's rights? This is kind of the core question here when it comes to, this attempt to promote public health and actually applying restrictions to people. Do these restrictions really violate rights? Because that's where it seems like the moral issue kind of comes in. Um, Having your rights kind of restricted maybe isn't the same thing as having your rights violated. And so the question then is, well, where's the line, and what does it take for a certain kind of restriction imposed on you by, say, another person or a government? When does that restriction constitute a rights violation? And when is it not really a rights violation? Because ultimately that's kind of the debate that many people are having in the country right now is, not being able to go to church service, Is that a violation of your right to freedom of religion? Not being able to not wear your mask in a restaurant, is that really some kind of rights violation of your freedom? It's very, I think, unclear and probably not. Right? But here's what, restrictions on freedoms are often sort of difficult and undesirable, right? You don't want to have to restrict people's freedoms, and you don't want, like, as a person, to have your freedoms restricted. But it's very unclear whether or not these kinds of restrictions done for the sake of public good ever actually rise to the level of rights violations, right? So if a restriction, and we can sort of, I think, rest on this kind of principle. If a restriction is deemed necessary for some particular aim, where the necessary aim is a certain kind of good, and it requires individuals to stop or start some activity that they do not wish to participate in, does it violate their rights? Well, I think it's going to ultimately depend. And it depends on what rights are at issue. So think about, like, this, take this case study. Think about the case of, like, someone that's on suicide risk, right? Well, what kinds of situation in that case, like, this is like the ultimate case, I think, of what we might think of as paternalism that is justified paternalism. In a case of justified paternalism, a case of somebody that's like sort of on suicide watch, you you are kind of morally allowed, it seems, to take away the person's means to do the thing that they seem to want to do, right? Take their own life. And you are also sort of morally allowed to restrict that person's freedom, right, to move. Um, are these is this person's rights, are they being violated, or is there or are in some way, are they just being restricted, and are they being protected? So it's an interesting question whether or not, a person actually has a right to take one's own life, right? Whether or not one has a right to do with one's life as one pleases, or not. Uh, Luckily, I think for the most part, what is it? I think suicide tends to be uh, preventable in some cases. Not with somebody that is hell bent on it, but it is often the kind of thing that people can be talked out of in the right situation. Usually, things are not nearly as bad as they think they are, and things do get better. Right, life situations do change. Your emotional state will improve. Right, and there's a big difference between the common cases where people take their own lives, and cases in which, like, there's no hope at the end of life because somebody has a terminal illness or something like that. Most cases of suicide are not cases like that, where in those kinds of cases things might actually change, right? One of the issues, and one of the sort of reasons for thinking that I think that no rights are violated, especially, like, in particularly in a case where somebody's saving someone from themselves, like a case of suicide prevention. And one of the reasons that paternalism is justified in these kinds of cases comes to the fact that ultimately freedom, the kinds of our own autonomy, has preconditions, preconditions that need to be promoted and protected in order for the very possibility of anyone ever having freedom or autonomy, right? So autonomy, again, is the freedom that someone has to act and decide what to do with their, for themselves. They have the freedom to sort of set their own goals, set their own ends, aim at certain things, take the means to those ends, right? Act in certain ways such as to try and bring about the particular ends that they desire. But there's lots of things that are necessary in order to have autonomy. You need to be alive. You need to have some semblance of health, so that you can move around and do the things that you want to do. You have to be aware, right? You can't be passed out or under the influence of certain kinds of things, and have actual full autonomy. There can't be certain things that, in a sense, are controlling you or lessening your autonomy to be fully free. And then finally, you need to actually know some things in order to be autonomous. You need to know what it is that it takes for you to actually achieve the goals that you have, as well as, what your goals really are, right? And sometimes there are bits of information that you don't know that you would need to know to actually be able to achieve the goal that you have. And so sometimes those bits of information, are things that you do need in order to truly act freely. So it seems that if a restriction on certain kinds of freedoms pertains to the protection of the preconditions necessary for freedom in the first place, they're not necessarily violations of rights, right? So a restriction that promotes health, life, uh, knowledge, and awareness, these kinds of things, restrictions that promote those things tend not to actually violate anyone's rights, because in order to actually have rights, freedom in the first place, one needs all of those things. So let's take some examples. Like first, imagine like a case of a parachute malfunction, right? You are jumping out of an airplane with a parachute, right? Um, you don't know that the parachute that you have is defunct, right? Malfunctioning. Someone stops you from jumping out of the airplane before you do. You really want to. You're hell bent on jumping out this airplane because you want to go skydiving. But someone stops you from jumping out. Um, have they violated your rights? No, right? Why not? Well, because you didn't know that your parachute was malfunctioning. So it might have been one of those things where in the moment it sort of seemed like they were violating your rights, but they didn't actually violate your rights because they were protecting what you actually wanted out of the entire situation, right? Which was to be safe and land safely. You wouldn't have done that. You would have lost your life. And so it's in this kind of context, it doesn't seem like them stopping you from doing what you freely kind of are able to choose to do. It's not right because you aren't actually freely choosing what it is that you're not being able to take the right steps towards the right thing in this case because there's a piece of information that you are missing. So knowledge in this case, being able to get the knowledge, being stopped until you have the right knowledge, doesn't seem like an actual rights violation. It's just a restriction. Similarly, like stopping, so like in like a boxing fight or in like a UFC fight, stopping somebody, stop it, like the referee is sort of on the hook to stop the fight once somebody has lost their awareness, right? Once somebody has kind of um, been knocked out, right? And in that case, right, there's no like restriction that seems to be a violation of anyone's rights in this case. Once you've lost the awareness, the ability to actually be aware, to choose for yourself, um, it's okay for someone to restrict what you can possibly do in that situation. Similarly, maybe somebody that's drank too much or is on a certain kind of mind altering substance, it doesn't seem problematic to it doesn't seem like a rights violation to stop them from doing certain things that are going to ultimately be dangerous for them, simply on the basis of the fact that they have diminished awareness. And then finally, seatbelt laws, right? Seatbelt laws, you have to wear your seatbelt. Is that not, why is that not a rights violation? Well, it's because it's there to protect your life, right? It's something that you need to do in order to protect your own life, and so the requirement there is a restriction on your freedom, whether you can drive around unencumbered by something very like small strapped around you. Um, this is the kind of thing that, like, obviously there's not really any rights violated there, partly because ultimately these restrictions are put in place to protect the preconditions necessary for you to continue living and having freedoms and doing things that you would want to do in the first place. Now that gives us one sort of boundary, but what about the other side? When is it the case that restrictions do actually violate rights? And here's sort of a way of thinking about it, maybe. If a restriction goes beyond protecting the preconditions for freedom and restricts an individual's ability to decide for themselves under reasonable and informed conditions, then it may be that an individual's rights are being violated. So here, like, sort of a um, the flipped coin from the examples earlier. If you have a working parachute, you really want to jump out of an airplane, right, to go skydiving, and somebody stops you from skydiving simply on the basis of the fact that they think it's dangerous. Well, that seems like a rights violation, right? Of course, it's dangerous, but you have a working parachute. You're going to be safe in your in your parachuting, in your skydiving. This is the kind of thing where it seems like a person can reasonably be informed of what's going to happen and know enough. But if somebody stops them, if somebody restricts their freedom in this case to choose for themselves what they want to do, um, it seems like somebody's actually violated their rights, right? Similarly, like prematurely ending a boxing fight or something when someone hasn't lost their awareness simply on the basis of the fact that uh, you know, boxing is dangerous and somebody can get hurt, right? Of course, somebody could get hurt. That's part of the sport. That's it would be a rights violation to stop someone from partaking in the sport under fully informed uh, and consenting on their own. Similar, and then like also, what is it? Parents that don't allow their children to drive. I mean, or they're 16, 17, 18-year-olds to drive simply on the basis of the fact or the idea that it's dangerous, right? Driving is, of course, dangerous. It's always a risk when you get behind the wheel. But once somebody is, once somebody is of a reasonable age and reasonable ability, and once they are informed, they're trained in the right kinds of ways, simply restricting someone on the basis of the idea that something is dangerous, while maybe that seems like an attempt to protect the preconditions for freedom, it actually seems to overstep its bounds, right? It goes beyond mere protection and into kind of overprotection in certain ways. Like this constitutes ultimately, I think, um, what is seen as the bad form of paternalism, right? It's an attempt at something like overprotection out of fear or some kind of other emotional distress. So, is it permissible to sort of violate someone's rights in a case where there's sort of uncertainty, and then out of a sense of like protection or caution, an abundance of protection and caution? It's an interesting question, if and when it ever is permissible to sort of actually violate someone's rights. I mean, so this is where things get a little bit tricky, depending on how you want to talk about these things, right? In under one way of speaking, ethicese, right? Uh, you you would say anytime someone's violated someone else's rights, they've done something wrong, so it would always be impermissible. But it seems like in these kinds of cases, right, we have certain kinds of rights that are given to us, sort of legally speaking, and those kinds of rights seem to be, um, morally permissible to violate, right, in certain kinds of cases. So someone might have a legal right, and it might be permissible to violate that legal right under certain guises where it's possible. You might think to do that out of an attempt to protect them or protect one of the other preconditions on their freedom. Um, but that's just it. What I'm asking here then is simply in a case in which there is some danger, and out of a sense of protecting them or um, an extreme sense of caution, and in a situation in which things are uncertain, just because the future is generally uncertain, is it ever going to actually be okay for you to stop someone from doing something, thereby restricting them, taking away, or actually violating a legal right that they might have to do that thing? Um, and that's kind of ultimately what we need to do here, is to a cost benefit analysis. Similarly, though, when it comes to thinking about this attempt to, or like, when it comes to thinking about what it is to really violate someone's rights in this case, we need to know what it is for something to be reasonable and what it is for someone to be informed, right? So here we've got this idea of like, there need to be reasonable conditions and informed conditions for it to be clear already that a restriction goes beyond protecting these kind of preconditions, and then it constitutes violating a right. So what is it to be reasonable and what is it to be informed? I think being informed is clear, right? Being informed, you need to have all the information. Clearly, like in the parachute case, you don't have all the information, and so you're not informed. And so, that's part of why it's not ultimately a rights violation. But what is it to be reasonable? Well, that gets a lot more tricky. Context is going to matter. Context, knowledge, what people have thought and said before. Here, I think, is where science is actually going to kind of come into play. Actually having a lot of the data and being able to read the data and being able to know and distill the data. So what is reasonable to do when it comes to thinking about health decisions? Well, one thing that's reasonable is to listen to your doctor or talk to your doctor, right? And so in these kinds of cases, what a doctor thinks is reasonable, at least with respect to the healthcare cases, is probably reasonable, right? Or you can poll lots of doctors to find out what they all think, or most of them think, is reasonable. But these kinds of issues, become much more complicated once we start complicating the cases, right? And that's where once people stop being as well informed and there stops being as much data or information out there, it becomes much less clear what counts as reasonable, right? And as long as once it stops being clear what counts as reasonable, then it stops being clear whether or not a certain restriction actually constitutes anything like a rights violation. So this is ultimately kind of what I'm saying here too, is if you don't know if you're violating rights, there's lots of uncertainty about whether or not certain actions are actually protecting the preconditions for freedom, right? And that's a very difficult thing to say, right? If you are being overly protective in a way that is ultimately paternalistic, you might not know that you're being overly protective, right? And if you don't know, are you actually violating rights? Well, that's an interesting question. I think that probably you are, but then there's this further question of how blameworthy actually are you in this kind of situation, right? When you are uncertain about whether or not you're protecting personal freedoms, or people. So this is other kinds of questions, or similar issues, like teenagers, right? People that are of age between 14 and 18 are until you're 18, your legal guardian gets to make lots of decisions for you. But after sort of 14, 15, 16, you are fully capable of making those decisions on your own. You just might not know enough, or know better. And so it's an interesting question whether or not a parent ever violates the rights of a teenager on the basis of restricting certain freedoms of the teenager. Similarly, people with certain kind of mental disabilities or handicaps, or people that are old, people that have Alzheimer's, people that have dementia. It's unclear sometimes when you actually are violating their rights, going against their wishes. Finally, so this brings us to another great case study, the case study of vaccines, right? And vaccines are very interesting and important right now. And there are lots of interesting and difficult moral questions that kind of come with this whole case, right? So can you morally require someone to get a medical procedure? That seems like a very interesting and difficult question to answer. So I need to take into account, right, people's beliefs and desires, right? If someone believes that the medical procedure will not help them, or if they believe that for some reason, in some way, that the medical procedure is wrong, and they very much desire not to have that procedure, Um, would it be wrong? Would it be overly paternalistic to force them to have that procedure in the service of an attempt at public health, or in the service of an attempt at providing them health? Um, it seems like it might be a kind of overreach, right? To force someone in this kind of case. But then there's different kinds of force that are worth thinking about as well, right? So, and lots of this kind of has come up more recently. So, can like the airlines require that you be vaccinated before you fly on an airplane? Well, it's an interesting question. What is the right to fly on an airplane? Is it a personal right? Is it sort of like what exactly is it? What is your right to be inside of a vehicle? Where you've paid to be inside that vehicle. Do these companies have the ability to kind of say, hey, look, in order for you to have this freedom, you must do this thing that we need you to do in order to protect our employees and everyone else involved. Um, is that fair? Is that something that's that they can actually do to people, or would that be an overstep? Would that be an overreaction in some way that is problematically restricting what people can do? There's different levels of kind of force, right? So already at this point in the United States before the pandemic, most children, with unless they have like a religious or health exemption, had to have certain vaccines in order to go to public school. And if you didn't have those vaccines, because you're just had some like a family member that had some ideas about whether or not vaccines are problematic, then you're just not allowed to go to be at that school, to be in that public group, on the basis of the idea that you bring down you cause a possible health risk, right, for these people. Um, so yeah, vaccines are very interesting and very kind of worth thinking about when it comes to trying to determine whether or not certain kinds of public health benefits, public health, like an attempt to protect public health, whether or not that can be, you know, like whether or not forcing people to get vaccines is a rights violation, right? Um, I mean, obviously, getting the vaccine of your own free will, accord, is not doing something necessarily bad for yourself. It seems, at least at this point, the risks of most vaccines are very, very low. Um, and so it's, plausibly, you might think, a good thing. It's something that you can do to kind of help fulfill your duty to other people and to their, to the general health. So of course, like getting a vaccine is a good thing, but the interesting sort of moral question comes when there's a kind of requirement that involves something like force, and then there are different ways of thinking about what force actually amounts to. So kind of coming towards the end here, is there really a right thing to do in a pandemic, right? And I think one answer obviously is yes, of course, right? There's of course a right thing to do, um, but it's really difficult to sort of know what that right thing to do is. And so, because it's really difficult to know, it's not so clear that we should blame people for getting things wrong, or at least blame people nearly as strongly. Um, it would seem that we should at least be gracious and recognize that not all the information is in at this point. Most of the decisions that the individuals are making, uh, and that policymakers are making, are being made out of an abundance of caution. And so the question of whether or not people's rights are actually being violated will sort of be litigated over the near future. Now, I think, though, that being said, there are some definitely basic moral duties and obligations that people have to one another that we should be fulfilling and not kind of, being so difficult over, which is part of the whole issue with the politicization of the entire pandemic. Um, and these are just things like, we should generally be trying to be good. And insofar as we should generally be trying to be good, we should be trying to help people and make sure that other people don't get sick. Putting yourself at a small amount of risk to, allow other people to be at ease or to actually improve public health, it seems like a fair trade, right? It's not very much effort, morally speaking, on your part, in order to go out to get the vaccine or to wear masks or to try and socially distance as much as possible. It seems like like there are obvious things that we can do in trying to avoid violating people's rights. And then there are also obviously things that we shouldn't do, right? Things that seem obviously immoral. And what's sort of at issue here, I think, in general, is it's very unclear what the specific things are to do that we should do simply because we are in a pandemic. The specific policy decisions, the specific procedures, the specific actions that we should and shouldn't take, that is difficult to know like exactly, right, what the right thing to do is. But that doesn't mean that we don't still have the same general sense of the kinds of right and wrong things to do that we normally do have. The thing here is that there's just a lot more information, right? As the sort of article put it, I think the facts change rather quickly. I think that the reading the article was published in August of 2020, and at that point, 6 months out from the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of information had shifted, and things have even changed more now, right? And so many things have been added, and this creates more information, more stuff for us to have to actually think about and figure out before we take certain kinds of actions. But yeah, it doesn't diminish our ability to act and attempt and our ability to attempt to act in the right way. Looking towards the future, there's certainly going to be more pandemics, right? Hopefully nothing as big as this in at least our lifetimes, but I mean, there may be. But I think we can all learn from our mistakes in this pandemic, which is, hopefully what we should be doing in all kinds of situations. We should always be attempting to learn from any mistakes that we have, that we've made. And clearly in this kind of modern day context where people are traveling a lot and we've had to shut everything down, it seems like we can know in the future what constitutes an overreaction and what constitutes an underreaction in different ways in different cases. And then certainly we can shore up certain sorts of resources or fund disaster relief efforts in order to help, for the future. But context matters, right? And different situations are going to require different responses. There's the SARS outbreak required a very different response because it didn't spread nearly as fast as COVID, right? And it was more deadly, but it wasn't as big of an outbreak. So different responses are warranted. If something like COVID that was more deadly came about, then we would probably still have to be in more of a lockdown situation. And, that might be difficult to actually live in that situation for a longer period of time. But, but it may be the kind of thing that's necessary in order to salvage some kind of public health. So finally, we get the overarching kind of question here, right? Is what ultimately is the best ordering of values when it comes to individualism and the public good, right? Should we take individuals' rights more seriously and allow people to sort of do what they wish to do more often? Or should we be taking the public good more seriously and restricting people's activities more often, right? In the light of the public good. Also, like, what in the world is the public good, right? Like, it's there's a huge difference, right, between whatever we mean by the public, like what's good for all of us, and what's good for each and every one of, like, individually, right? What's good for us. And of course, it's like often the classic debate. Everybody wants what's best for themselves. Morality seems to be relating, like have something more to do with what's best for everyone. And so you end up with this kind of classic debate between what you might think of as egoism and altruism, where egoism is doing what's best for you, and altruism is doing what's best for your group or those around you. And then the question comes: are there egoistic reasons? That is, are there self-centered, self-interested reasons for you to help the larger group? Well, it seems like at least there are some, there are many in this kind of case, this kind of context, and I think that most of them are just health centered, right? You should do things like get the vaccine and wear masks, both because they protect you and because they protect everyone else. And if everyone else acts that way, you also are protected. So there's in some way both an egoistic point of view that you ought to help other people in acting in these good ways, as well as you can simply be altruistic and think, what I ought to do is I ought to do what's going to do the most good for the most people. Um, yeah. Finally, some like ideas for discussion for writing in the discussion section. Um, and this kind of, just wrapping things up. There's particular issues regarding the ethics of vaccines that I think are very interesting, but are difficult to sort of bring up in this kind of lecture format and go over. But they're in the reading, and so if anyone is interested in any particulars regarding that, then I think it's worth discussing further. And then also, sort of, there's lots of general considerations pertaining to individual freedoms and public goods, and what kinds of rights are worth foregoing in order to protect the public good, right? So, like, the obvious ones here, like, foregoing traveling long distances in order to protect people's health. Um, but there's sort of good questions of, like, what kinds of things are going too far. So, are there restrictions that you've seen or that you've heard about that would clearly seem to constitute now restrictions that have gone too far, that have actually violated maybe someone's rights, or just aren't actually functioning well as restrictions on individuals in order to actually achieve the goal of the public good or public health? All right, have a great rest of your day.